Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mike. You guys are rocking with me on Mike's Intellectual Corner. On today's episode, we are going to be checking out the Fallen of World War II. I thought, there's been a few different people recommending it, and I thought since we're already in the middle of our Eastery series of the Eastern Front, might as well, let's get a real good sense of, how many people actually died out here, while we are in our other series. That way, we can absorb it a little bit better. With that being said, again, don't forget to check out my short series called Today in History. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Without further ado, let's just go ahead and get right into it, guys.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost.
Yeah, I feel like any living person alive today who's in World War II in any type way, fashion, or sense, honestly, is like they're almost immortalized in what is almost what I feel like is one of our legendary annals of history. Like the conquest of Alexander, the great passage to Mecca by Mansa Musa, World War II, World War I. Like these are like legendary things that are almost like the Iliad of historical events. So definitely respect to anyone still alive or anyone who went through it, period. So let's get back.
This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, that was about their average age, because I think even whenever I was a section chief, with like 7 other, soldiers under me, I was still the oldest one in that section at 26? And so I'm over thinking and everybody under me, other than my sergeant, who was my same age, everybody else was between 19 and 23, so yeah, that about makes sense. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. It's kind of sad too, but alright guys, let's go ahead and get back into it.
The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who are injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell. So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died.
Anytime I think of the Pacific Theater, I always think of Hacksaw Ridge for some reason. Like that battle scene, just where the battlefield almost looks like a page out of Dante's Inferno or some crazy stuff. You know what I'm saying? But for some reason, that's what I always think about. But anyway, let's go ahead and keep it going, guys. All right, sorry guys, I had to change my chair out a little bit. Let's keep it going though.
Lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi...
Yeah, that Blitzkrieg was, unfortunately that Blitzkrieg was too lethal. It was like, a 20th century Napoleonic Corps, type of, like, it was too lethal for its time, essentially, and as we can see it from here. Alright, let's keep it going, guys.
The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US.
Look at all these lives lost, you know what I'm saying? All these fathers, brothers, sons, all of them just used for the war machine, the fed to the meat grinder, just because of one selfish man's, one man's selfish, bullshit. And, excuse my language, but it's crazy to think about what, whole nations will do for one person's, I don't know. It's crazy to think about. Let's go ahead and get back into it, guys.
Stalingrad, as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany. The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost.
Like, look at all these family trees just wiped out. All the men just wiped out on these family trees, you know what I'm saying? And really, this is just soldiers, so you gotta think of civilians too. These are just whole family trees literally just being wiped out on the face of the earth. It's ridiculous.
8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead. To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe. Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station.
I remember back in 2017, I deployed to Europe, and we were in Poland. We got a chance to visit Auschwitz. And you know, you see all the documentaries, you see all the TV shows, all the games, everything that can depict World War II. But when you're actually right there and you're seeing like the actual, like, you know, hardwood of, you know, of what was actually there, you see the picture, you see what was actually in the pictures, you see it for yourself, and it's like, wow, you know what I'm saying? It's another experience, especially whenever you actually see the actual big piles of shoes and the hair that they actually have to shave off, and the wedding rings and the luggage and all that stuff. It actually makes it a lot more real than just, you know, seeing it in documentaries and stuff like that. I definitely have to say it. But let's go ahead and get back into it, guys.
Deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt. The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation. Some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million.
And it's really sad too, because you know, that wasn't even the original plan. The original plan was supposed to be to send all the Jewish people and all the Slavic people, I think, maybe the Slav people, I'm not sure. But I know, especially for the Jewish people, to send them all to Madagascar, because since it was at the time owned by France and, you know, technically a France colony, they were going to use it, and since they technically own France, they were going to use it as a place to put everyone. But as war started breaking out and getting more intense, you know, it just got to the point where they had to do this final solution, and we have what we have. Guys, let's go ahead and get back into it, though.
As many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million. Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered.
I know sometimes those British air raids would sometimes even last, like, I think 6 hours at a time. So, you know, can you imagine getting bombed for 6 hours at a time? So it is no wonder why they produce such a high casualty rate. And then at the same time, we can kind of see why the Soviets or the Red Army or whatever, the Soviet Union, we can see why they came and they were so ruthless whenever they kind of went back over that border on the way towards Berlin, and why, you know, there was so much murder and unfortunately so much rape and all that stuff, because during, you know, Germans, invasion, it was so essentially so ruthless on their end as well. You know, we saw literally millions of deaths. So at this point, you know, it's kind of, it was just vengeful. Let's go get back into it, guys.
If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all...
Kind of wanted him to talk about more about Indian casualties as well, but that's okay. We'll probably look it up a little bit later after this.
When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list.
It almost kind of makes you feel like if you were kind of an adult between like 1913 and 1945, your life was pretty crappy for a few decades there, if you think about it. Those are probably like one of the worst decades in history, probably. Right, let's get back to it.
Grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If we want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking. When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase "the long peace" to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest...
Well, and the Kosovo situation in 1999 too, you can't forget that. And I want to say the Russia and Ukraine situation too. Just saying, but those I think are... Well, not the Kosovo, but the other one's rather new. So
was smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between...
Well, plus that almost changed too with the Iran situation, I think, last year. And I feel like the Korea War was pretty big too. I know that was a small country, but still, they're not really, because they're still at a nuclear power.
Wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs, or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of...
Personally, I just think it's probably mainly because we're all so dependent on each other's trade. But I personally do think that war in Africa or Middle East or in Europe will be inevitable in the coming centuries, probably. It's just too much. too unpredictable. But just gonna get back to it.
When it occurs, or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might. If you would like to support this project and encourage new episodes, please follow us using one of the options below. And consider paying the suggested ticket price for today's show. Thank you very much.
Alright guys, we're going to stop right there. Great video. Definitely a different feeling whenever you see it visualized like that, those type of numbers visualized like that. And even then, I feel like it would even be even more different feeling actually seeing the bodies in front of you, stuff like that. It's just something that, you know, our brains, I feel like, just can't really catch on or comprehend, or I don't know. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for joining me on another episode of Micah's Intellectual Corner. Please don't forget to check out my shorts today in history. With that, I'll see you guys later. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys when I see you. I'm out.